Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the 13th episode of Shots with Soldiers. Happy Earth Day. We have a great guest host for you today. Dr. David O'Keefe is back, our second time host. So hi, everybody. We're super excited for that. So we are going to now have Dr. David O'Keefe do a presentation. And yeah, I'll hand it over to him.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Hope everybody is doing well. It's nice to see that the vaccines are rolling out. And as a matter of fact,
you're muted.
Am I? Oh, I shouldn't be. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, for some reason I wasn't. Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot, Bruce, for inviting me back again. This time, I promise it won't be as long as the first time. Also, too, I hope everybody's doing well in the pandemic, or as well as can be expected. Exciting news is, of course, that the vaccines are rolling out, and I just got my jab today. So as a result, I'm keeping my fingers crossed I'm able to get through this before, of course, the side effects hit. But you know, there seems to be a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel in all this. So, you know, fingers crossed. Tonight is an interesting discussion about one gentleman in particular who I'll get to in a minute. And of course, the idea about tonight is to understand the importance of sharing a drink with comrades in arms. And of course, this is something that's been important since the dawn of time when it comes to soldiers. And largely, not only is it because it tends to steady one's nerves in wars past, but also, too, it's that last link between civilization and the front line. In other words, the one day or the day that you're sharing that drink with your buddies up on the front line seems to indicate that search for peace, the idea of sitting down when everything is over and actually just kind of breaking bread and sharing some time with each other, kind of like we all will do again within the next little while, without a doubt. All right, with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share the screen and just hopefully everybody is seeing that right now. Tonight, we're going to be talking about an officer, a platoon commander from the Black Watch of Canada, Lieutenant Sammy Nichols. Sammy Nichols actually is a very interesting character. He was from Red Deer, Alberta. As a matter of fact, he was born in the United States and moved to Alberta with his family when he was a child and was raised in Alberta. So very much an Alberta boy. And when the war broke out, he ended up, World War II that was, he ended up joining the 3rd Field Regiment and he became a gunner. In 1944, in the fall of 1944, as you probably know, we were stretched, the Canadian Army was, for reinforcements. We had taken horrific casualties in the Battle of Normandy amongst our infantry, more than we ever expected. And as a result, there was a real dearth in infantry trained reinforcements. So Sammy ended up volunteering to transfer to the infantry. And he ended up arriving in late November of 1944 with the Black Watch. By this time, the Canadian Army was sitting on the Maas River, where it would be for the next 3 months. And it was engaged in a static form of warfare across the Maas, where the Germans were on one side of the Maas River and the Canadians were on the other. And so one of the reasons why he decided he was going to leave the artillery and go into the infantry was really a question of his character. And what I'm showing you here is absolutely fascinating. This is actually the report from the number 3 battle wing. So basically when he was doing his platoon commander's combat course. And as a result, you can see he is everything that you would want in a platoon commander. In other words, he was quick to grasp the situation. He was, of course, responsible, dependable, exceptional self-control, more importantly, calm and confident. And of course, he was willing to learn. He was great at making decisions. and he could get well in the picture, as they say. In other words, all his decisions and his appreciations were incredibly sound. Of course, the other thing that I would probably argue his crusty old NCOs would probably like, he had an abundance of common sense, which is not usually something you get in a young platoon commander, but in this case, you did. The interesting part is, look near the bottom. There was actually, as you can see here, they have the data course, the leadership up at the top, stability, alertness, etc. Look at the bottom, guts. Sammy had plenty, according to their assessment. Well, sure enough, he ended up taking over a platoon in the Black Watch, the 1st Battalion of Canada's Black Watch, in the wintry conditions in 1944 and 45. And his first job, or one of the first patrols that he actually took out, came after a massive drinking binge. As a matter of fact, it was New Year's Day, 1945. And it was the same day that the Germans had launched what was called the Hangover Raid. And this was the last big German air raid of the war, which basically shook everybody out of their beds from partying the night before. And of course, it reminded everybody that the war was still on and still had to be won. Well, later on that night, Nichols was told to take out a patrol of about three or four men, and they were to go out and try to grab a prisoner. And of course, they made it across the frozen Maas River, but you can imagine what it was like. It wasn't a very good night for patrolling. It was a moonlit night, not exactly the kind of conditions you want, and it was clear. And so here you are going across an icy river and then into a flat expanse that was covered by snow that had been sitting there for weeks. So in other words, it was slippery and it was crunchy. So in other words, the worst possible conditions you can think of for taking out a patrol on that night. Well, as you can probably imagine, the Germans were quite alert to this kind of activity, and sure enough, saw him and his patrol coming and opened fire. As a result, after the scramble, he was able to extricate his patrol and get him back to Canadian lines. But when he got back, after all the fire and the fury, he realized, they had lost a man and they had no clue where he was. So as a result, he grabbed another 4 men, and with a fighting patrol of 8 men, he went back out. And he decided he was going to go out and try to rescue this one man that he left behind. Obviously, it was something that he couldn't let himself live with. Well, being a bit of gung-ho, but very much of a rookie, the Germans on the other side were anything but rookies. And so as a result, he walked right into a trap, as he was attempting to close in on an area that he suspected housed a German machine gun position. 3 more machine guns opened up from the flanks on his fighting patrol. The fighting patrol, from what we understand, was either all killed or they scattered. And he actually, at one point, charged straight at the German position. And when he did, he was lucky enough to survive simply, part of his Lee Enfield jammed, and he was winged by a German bullet. And as a result, he ended up going into German captivity. And if you can see down here on the map, these would have been the Canadian or the Black Watch positions on the west side of the Maas River. And all of this area was the German forward position, and then their main defensive lines in the Reichwald Forest, which was their main defensive position in the entire, in the Western Front in 1945. So as a result, he was taken as prisoner and then marched back into this area of the Reichwald. And that's where the story really begins, because immediately Sammy Nichols decided he was not going to go into captivity. He had heard recently about the massacre of American prisoners of war at Malmedy in the opening stages of the Battle of the Bulge, and he kind of figured he was kind of in store for this. So as a result, he constantly or continually tried to plan his escape. And as he was being marched to the back, he started to collect what would be human intelligence gold, if you will, committing everything he saw to memory, whether it be the types of uniforms, the tabs, the colors on the tabs of the German soldiers, what they were smoking, what kind of German they were speaking, whether there was a kind of a dialect, where, anything and everything he could find. The other thing he was always looking at were signs. In other words, directional signs in the German lines that would give him an indication of the local order of battle. And he was able to discern that what intelligence had told them a few days before, i.e. that they were facing Volksgrenadier, basically second-rate troops, was no longer current, because he ended up passing German Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, German airborne that had suddenly reinforced the area. And so he was able to realize immediately that the Canadians were going to be up against a far tougher opponent than they ever expected. Well, he ended up going in for interrogation. And the interrogator, who was part of this Fallschirmjäger unit, tried to get him to sign a false declaration that the Allies had been murdering German prisoners of war. And he kind of figured that this would be his final act. In other words, if he signed this, then he would end up with a bullet in his head. And of course, then he would feed into German propaganda. He refused to do it. He was threatened with being taken to the Gestapo. Apparently, he was hit a few times. There was some physical abuse that was given. And then finally, he was taken out to a slaughterhouse. And in the slaughterhouse, he was kept as a prisoner. But of course, at this time, he was also planning his escape. So what he was doing was quite cagey. He decided that he was going to feign that he had dysentery or diarrhea. And over the next 24 hours, he successfully was able to get 15 trips to the latrine. And every time he went out, he called it his latrine recce, where basically he did the same thing. He sized up the area, figured out where the lines were, figured out the best potential escape route. And then finally, on the 15th time, he made his move. And sure enough, in the middle of the night, he took off and ended up actually doubling back. What he did was, instead of going straight towards Canadian lines, because he figured the Germans would be expecting him, he actually button hooked and went backwards towards Germany and then swung around. And over the next 4 days, he laid low during the day, during daylight, and then at night, he moved slowly. And when I talk about slowly, I mean slowly, because he had to get through the most heavily defended part of the Western Front when it came to the German defenses. And he had to crawl. And if anybody's ever been to the Reichwald Forest, you know the kind of terrain I'm talking about. And it was very difficult to do it. And then, of course, if he was successful enough to actually make it here, then he had to go over 2 kilometers of essentially wide open land to be able then to make it back to Canadian hands. Well, in the miracle of all miracles, he did it. After 4 days, he reached Black Watch lines. And you can imagine they could not believe that here he was returning. The best part about it was he had recorded everything mentally that he had encountered, and then immediately sat down with division intelligence and told them everything. So impressed were they thought this was human intelligence gold. And you can imagine, for those of you who've been in Afghanistan, you knew that sometimes your electronic or signals intelligence and all the latest intelligence would only go so far. You needed that kind of, personal, intimate interaction. Well, that's what he brought. And so as a result, not only was division intelligence impressed, but also Corps, Army, Army Group, and SHAEF. And as a matter of fact, what you're seeing in front of you is the 3-page report that was issued to every unit on the Western Front when it came to his exploits. Well, as you can imagine, after going through something like this, indeed, he was recommended for the Military Cross. As a matter of fact, it was considered to be one of the greatest exploits in Canadian military history. Why he didn't get the Victoria Cross, I have no clue. But the Military Cross, of course, was awarded almost immediately. And this came as a great relief to the Black Watch because they had suffered quite a lot up until the winter of 1945. And they needed a real shot in the arm, a real booster, if you will. No pun intended for the current state we're in. Well, at this particular point, they realized what he had been through, and they decided that they were going to send him back to London. They were going to send him back for personal investiture by the king at Buckingham Palace. And at the end of the month, he was also going to get about 2 weeks leave, and then hopefully he'd be back, of course, to lead another platoon in combat. Well, part of that, of course, was taking off from an airfield in Belgium, which he did on January 29th, 1945. But sadly, before he could receive his military cross, the plane crashed on landing in England. He was killed immediately. Going through all that, only to die in an accident on landing in England. Such is the fickle nature of war. So tonight, if you will all join me, tonight we drink to the memory of Sammy Nichols, a genuine Canadian hero. Cheers.
Cheers.
Wow, that was an incredible story.
Yeah.
Let's open this up for some questions. Anybody have any questions?
I got one right off the top, if it's okay.
Yeah.
First off, David, a fantastic visual presentation. Really great. That really brought it to life. I know that took a lot of work.
Thanks.
And this is an odd one. I want to kind of throw it out to those of you who are veterans that have been in combat. David, you said early on in the story that they held the Mass River for 3 months. And I've read this many times in reading about military history. And what's it like to be stuck in one place for 3 months looking at the enemy?
Who wants to handle that?
It's called lockdown.
Yeah, exactly.
I kid you not. I mean, lockdown is very little different, to be 100% honest, to what it is like to be on operations and to be stuck in a camp and to be being in the same sort of confined space. You're restricted to an operating area that is maybe 10 to 15, 20 kilometers big. And then you go back home to your base and you see the same people day in, day out for 6 months. So I think actually a lot of Canadians are now experiencing, a window into operations. And I'm open to letting anyone else answer that question too.
Without gunfire.
Yeah, hopefully.
I know there was some frustration in Kandahar about the white school and how many times that we took it and had to give it back, and it took us forever to finally just raise it to the ground. So that was over a period of like 2 or 3 tours where, and afterwards that little patch of land was so contentious and took forever to finally come under control.
Yeah, you certainly get the same thing. I know the Black Watch, they weren't the only Canadian unit, obviously, that was on the Maz for 3 months. And what they would do is they would rotate them in and out. And so when they would come into a little town called Quake, and it was literally right on the banks. And if you go to Quake now, you can actually still see the church that's there. And they used to use the, believe it or not, the church tower. And they used to use it for observation. They would never put snipers in there because it was too obvious, but they would use it for observation. But there were certain nicknames that they ended up giving the opposite side of the Maz River because of the familiarization, right? Because of familiarity, they'd been there for so long. So a lot of times it wasn't the cusp over there or like, whatever it was, they would come up with some sort of nickname for it, something that was something that was kind of homegrown, if you will. But then, there was also a little bit of live and let live for a while. In other words, they're over there, we're over here. We're not firing at each other. We don't have to. Canadian High Command, or High Command in general, was not too thrilled with that. So they did put on a series of raids and, of course, patrols that were going on to keep, keep the fighting spirit up, if you will. But it's a barren piece of land, a real barren piece of land.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is not a well-known story. How did you, at least it's not well-known to me.
Yeah.
How did you learn it? And tell me more about the background.
This came through, actually, it was a mention. It started off as a mention in the Black Watch War Diary. And of course, I always tell people to go through the war diaries. They're amazing. Some of them are better than others. But there was a quick little mention of him and getting the military cross, and then, of course, dying in the aircraft accident. And then when I started looking into it, I was doing something else. I think I was working on, might have been my master's, and I was working on something about Verrières Ridge. And I happened to be going through intelligence summaries. And there was the 3-page intelligence summary that was written based on his exploits. So then I kind of cobbled this together, and I published it probably about 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago now, in Esprit de Corps magazine. And it was it's just one of those stories that stick with you. And it's just that cruel, unfair nature of it all, And also too, I suppose I was a kid in the 70s and I grew up on MASH, and it kind of reminds me of that Henry Blake episode, radar coming in and explaining, how Henry dies. There's just there's a little bit of that in there, without a doubt.
Except that Henry died because he didn't want to sign the contract for the next year.
Well,
in the TV show.
Details. Yeah, exactly.
It's incredible detail, David. I mean, like, I totally appreciate how the detail makes it come to life. Like, you've done an incredible amount of work on it, and like Gordon, like, I can't believe that this is the first time I've heard this story. It's epic.
It's, there's so many things like that in Canadian military history.
Thousands. Yeah.
You go to the archives, you spend as much time in the archives as I do, you're gonna find stuff. And truth is literally stranger than fiction, and particularly when it comes to this. And I have many more of these stories.
Have any stories like that, like, do they make their way into any curriculum anywhere in the country?
Not that I know of, not in any sort of official capacity, but then again, remember, I'm in Quebec, and there's a completely different approach when it comes to history here in Quebec as opposed to the rest of the country. Generally speaking, though, it's more idiosyncratic. In other words, it really takes the initiative of really gifted and committed history teachers to bring this into the curriculum, and this would be a great highlight. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If you want to teach about the Canadian Army on the Maas River in this is a great leader to get students fascinated and interested. Or, you could do it the opposite way. I mean, one thing that's amazing, and I think I spoke about this before, is that all our World War I soldiers, all their personnel files are available on the internet now. Same thing with our World War II dead. And you get a lion's share of their personnel files, which really can bring these guys back to life in many cases. I did that with 7 Days in Hell, my book on Normandy, where it was amazing to be able to, find out that, Corporal Bloggins, if you will, was actually a baker, or worked in the, emergency room of, the Montreal General Hospital before he went off to war. And, it just personalizes them. And it gives these men who now would otherwise just be names a little bit more dignity, to know a little bit more about them.
Well, I think it's important, but Kevin, I'll answer your question. They don't study Canadian history. As one who writes Canadian historical novels as a pastime, they don't study Canadian history in high school. And at one point, forgive me for going on a rant, but the only thing that was taught to Canadian students was the internment of Japanese, which is a significant story. But we weren't learning about the heroic activities of the Canadian soldiers. So no, it's not being taught to Canadian students.
Being a teacher myself, and I happen to be in Thompson, Manitoba, I was taking a walk around my high school, And funny we're talking about this. I just posted pictures to my high school's Google pictures. And I walked down the hallway and I was so pleasantly surprised and honored. I know that there are 2 teachers in our school that advocate honor for the men and women who have given their lives, who have given service and have come back alive, but shocked. And there was 5 walls, starting with the First World War, small amount of samplings, and then a large sampling of soldiers from World War II. And then there was the Korean War as well, and the Afghan War. I was fascinated with how the teachers got the students to individually research each one of the soldiers that was attributed to the students, and the write-ups were entail with great detail, and we're honoring to the memory of those men. So I think we're an oddity because we're so far north, but the teachers that are here have such quality, and that's a shout out to them. But I really, every day, I feel honored to be in that school with that staff, because they work so hard, and it's that unsung component. The teachers that are there really work hard to give a good flavoring for Canadian history to those students.
Good.
From school.
I have a question.
Yeah, Giselle.
David, if you had to pick one part of that story to highlight, just for discussion's sake, would you want to highlight more on the bravery and the example that he set by going back for that man that was left behind? Or would you want to focus more on the tenacity and for him coming back and being able to provide all that information going forward?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. That's like asking me to pick my favorite child. I have one, but I'll never say who. Yeah, no, that's a tough one. That's a tough one, because I think that all these elements are extremely important. In other words, he's not a one-dimensional character. I think part of it was the naivete going out the first time, and maybe even the second time, but he felt compelled to go out there. In other words, that was that sense of duty, that sense of honor, that sense of responsibility. I screwed up. I have to make this better. And then, of course, the second time it happens, oh my God, what do I do? And then, of course, he does the best that he can under all these circumstances and makes the best. So, yeah, Giselle, I think that's a thoroughly unfair question to ask me tonight. No, I just, it's a tough one. That's a tough one. And like I said, I just think it's the more, I kind of prefer the more well-rounded look at him. I think there's so many things that you can highlight there. And I think the whole thing is great for discussion, because there's so many different chapters just in that tiny little story that you could look at his motivations. You could look at the circumstances, the concept of redemption, the concept of courage. There's so many different things there. And then, of course, what really ties it all together is what every veteran of combat has ever told me. It's all about fate or luck. That's it. Nothing is written. Nothing is for sure. It doesn't matter. As soon as the bullets fly, it's out the window and it's fate or luck. Everyone I've ever met has told me that. Everyone I've interviewed. And that's just sums it up.
Well, that's a perfect ending. So thank you again for being our second guest host. Honestly, you've hit 2 home runs now to steal a phrase from your old baseball days. Valor in the presence of the enemy. We're growing. We've just hit the 12,000 mark. We're very happy about this. We're looking to keep expanding. We're looking for more likes and shares. If you see this, share it with your friends, like our videos, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for our next episode.
Before you say goodbye, Bruce, I got to show Sean. Hey, look, I got guitars too.
Okay, guys, we have stopped streaming and I am stopped recording.